Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. This is an anomalous coalition multi-subreddit AMA. We welcome all of you here. And I'm your host. My name's Leslie Kean. And I'm going to introduce two people who are joining me today for, I think, what will be a really interesting discussion with your questions included. They are Karin Austin, who is the executive director of the John Mack Institute, a project manager of the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University, and an experiencer who worked with Dr. John Mack. We're also joined by Dr. Peter Skafish, who is an anthropologist and the co-founder and executive director of the Soul Foundation. And I think everybody here is familiar with the great work of the Soul Foundation. So we are going to jump right into a discussion, and we're going to include a lot of your questions, but I just wanted to open up with kind of a broad question, which will help us get started and kind of orient us towards our two guests. And that is that Peter, I'll ask this directly to Peter and Karin. You have both been working and studying experiencers and the phenomena associated with the experiencer world for quite some time, but in very different ways and with different objectives and different orientations, but you're studying the same phenomenon. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear from each of you, what your work has been in that area and how you go about approaching it and what you might understand about it in terms of the way you frame it as an investigator or as an experiencer. So, Peter, do you want to go first with that?
Sure, I can start, Leslie, and thank you to the moderators of the Anomalous Coalition, and thank you, Karin, for agreeing to the dialogue. Looking forward to the conversation today. I've been, privately as an academic, I've looked at the broad UAP subject. I prefer that word to the phenomenon, but the UAP subject for 20 years privately. And a few years ago, I decided to turn my research exclusively to working on it around the time we started to put together Soul. And I felt a long time ago that the focus for those of us who understand that UAP objects and UAP vehicles are real should really be on the reports of humanoids and occupants. And I think everyone here knows what that means, so I won't explain the terms. And I felt that about 20 years ago, that's where the research should really be going in a rigorous sense, so that we would be able to have some very strong data as well as very strong empirical evidence for certain interpretations of what those occupants are and what the humanoids are. I use that term for when they're not seen with UAP. And so that's been a longstanding interest of mine. Now, in this spring of 2021, as I was finishing up primary work on a book I published recently called Rough Metaphysics, which is of interest to UAP studies because it concerns the ontology of anomalous and phenomena and things that science doesn't recognize as real. I started to review a large collection of basically humanoid and occupant reports going back to the 18th century. I can say more at some time about who assembled that and how they did it. But the long and short of it was that I felt that I wanted to do an initial survey of very raw data because it's not clear in this collection the quality of the investigations from which the reports come, how much they've been corroborated, and so on. But just dealing with raw data, what the types are of so-called humanoids that people report. I'm not saying they're real or not real, or that I believe them or don't believe them, taking a research perspective right now. And I wanted to do that because I felt that the kind of story or the lore that is in the popular discourse about UAP, that there are five, the five kinds of aliens claim. I didn't think that was accurate. I thought that was based on the assumption that there are certain types and that you can slot most reports into these types. So I did a very broad kind of survey for myself to get myself a strong orientation about how we would do future work on this. as we turn to founding, establishing, getting the ball moving with Soul, and then doing all the work you have to do to really get an organization up and running and do our symposiums and a lot of other things, advisory work with the governments, that work got kind of eclipsed. And this year in 2025, it's my focus for a book I'm writing now. And I intend to be, if I can pull it off, to be a really major theoretical statement about the UAP phenomenon, so-called, as a whole. I don't think we've had major statements about that in general, or that there are many of them, but we haven't had major statements since Mack and Vallée. And I think we need those. So the ambition of this research is to really produce a very broad general statement. Now, in short, to answer your question, my objectives with this are to really start to provide a initial model or interpretation of what the minds are behind UAP. And by that, I mean UAP vehicles, the stuff that is tangible and physical, or maybe becomes tangible and physical, as distinct from stuff that we might want to associate more with visionary religious experience. If we can make that distinction, I'm trying to make that distinction right now. I think there's a difference. So I want to understand the mind, the subjectivity, the consciousness behind UAP. And I don't think it's unitary. I think there are several things there. But I also want to understand the bodies of the occupants. Are there really physical, tangible bodies there? This is what people seem to report. Are they biological? Are they products of evolution? Are they are you looking at bodies that are products of a very advanced synthetic biology? So maybe they came out of evolution, transcended it. Are these, as some people think, something like beings with limited autonomy that are designed to manufacture, to somehow service and operate a UAP vehicle? I know for people who are not familiar with UAP as a problem, these sound like extremely exotic and marginal and implausible questions. But we have to remember that as both the executive branch and the legislative branch, branches of the United States government, have become much more forthcoming about the reality of UAP, we haven't had a real conversation about so-called aliens, or, to use the sanitized term, non-human intelligence. And I want to really help initiate a new conversation about that, in which we can be frank publicly about the fact that there is something beyond the vehicles themselves, and really start to soberly, but also with a great deal of imagination, because we need that, start to think about the data and the evidence. And to kind of, close off this introduction, what I'm working on right now is something I call the corporeal hypothesis. Instead of worrying about origins, which we'd associate with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the crypto or ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the interdimensional hypothesis, whatever people mean by that, in different syntheses or combinations of those possibilities, I'm saying let's explore the hypothesis that there are tangible bodies here that are somehow associated with the minds or the consciousnesses that we know are behind and accompanying UAP vehicles. And I'm posing it as a hypothesis because I think that it remains a matter of controversy for researchers, journalists, experiencers, people invested in the UAP problem, about whether there's actually something like a body accompanying these things. So that's my orientation. Those are my goals. That's a bit about my research and so on. So thanks, Leslie, and thanks for your patience, Karin.
Well, thank you, Peter. That's absolutely fascinating. If so many fascinating points there to think about. And I'm so glad you've taken this on and that you're doing what you're doing. I mean, it sounds incredible. And I think, Karin, why don't you jump in and share how you want to jump off of that? Because you got your work as well. Yeah.
Peter might have just done it.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It was pretty good. Say, I just head nod or ditto.
No, you have more to say. Let's hear it.
No, that was very eloquent, Peter. And I'm pleased that you were the one to start off first. I think you set the table very well. And there is I would say near 100% or 100%, overlap with what you're doing and what's motivating what you're doing and why we are doing it. So the first thing I would, and thank you guys obviously for inviting me and allowing me to join you for this conversation. I feel like I'm in rarefied air with the two of you. So it's a pleasure, and I'll try to keep up. When people ask what I'm up to with the research that we are doing, one of the first things I always like to do is to say it's not an I, it's not a me. We have a whole team of people who are highly, highly talented, qualified, intellectual powerhouses and deeply dedicated and warm, open-hearted human beings who are working for free, to try to get at the bottom of this. Not that we want to be working for free indefinitely. We would love to generate some resources to be able to compensate everybody who's participating, but we're doing our work on a string and a prayer sort of thing. So I think the group of us is probably about 10 people right now. So I just want to acknowledge that it's really the Archives of the Impossible and the John Mack Institute team, come together to get this work done. So that's thing one. Thing two is, again, just sort of echoing what Peter said, but maybe coming in from a slightly different doorway. I think, Peter, it sounds like you've come in as an intellectual and, including your own personal curiosity that you have around it. And obviously then you have this academic construct in it, and you bring this very high-minded, wonderfully high-minded approach to it. And if I'm being perfectly honest, mine is much more animal, kind of raw, and it has to do with, all of the frustrations that, myself and a whole generation of experiencers of abductees who were sidelined, in the past 2 decades, waiting for something to shift in this, cultural discourse. I think, and for many of us, assuming that there would never be this shift. I think, speaking for myself, I assumed I was going to go to the grave without any understanding of what this was, what this is, or without any formal, process of disclosure happening. And I just knew that where we left off, when John died, and it was really before that we, no matter how many different ways we tried to adapt our approach in the public education efforts, we always just ran flat into the brick wall of the dominant Western worldview. And we just couldn't get any farther past it. There's, a kind of a bell curve of the way people responded to what we were saying 30, 35 years ago. There would be people who would believe anything and people who would never believe anything. And then most everybody else that's sort of somewhere in between. And, it was exasperating. It's exasperating to be telling the truth to the best of one's ability and to have this profound set of experiences that are so deeply transformational personally, but also with enormous impacts for humankind. And to come at this, with the public education effort with such an open heart, the desire to do something right on behalf of humankind and on behalf of the truth, and to have it met with such vitriol and disdain and condescension, and that's speaking on behalf of and with affection and respect and appreciation for, the professional suicide that John effectively committed in putting himself out there, but also on behalf of all of the abductee community at the time who, really, like I said, tried and couldn't get any farther with it. So, after John died, I had to just check out. Like I had been, like many of the experiencers who worked with him, I'd just been front and center for too long. It's very hard to put something that's so personal, so deeply personal and profound out in the world to let everybody hear about it and make evaluations and assessments about it, which is frankly one of the reasons I don't like telling my narrative anymore. That's private. That's for me. But I got on with my life, and for the better part of 20 years, I just had a normal life, and nobody would have ever known that I was involved with this at all. And And then with COVID, like so many other people during this time period around 2020, 2021, the whole event just kind of knocked me onto this track. And I found myself back in, the John Mack Institute and directly connected with these archives that I had helped preserve immediately following his death. And it was in the transfer of these archives over to Rice University and working with Jeff Kreipel and Amanda Foke, who's the head of special collections over at Rice, that we realized that, together we wanted to undertake a metadata research study about these materials. So because, already Jeff has, or we have within Archives of the Impossible, including Whitley Strieber's collection and other collections like John's, materials that we can immediately work with to, analyze. And then, of course, we are also intent on acquiring other collections from other researchers who were well known at the time, and expect that process of acquisitions, I think, to take place over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But the bottom line is that, my core intention for this is to try to ground the data, ground information, get real data that we haven't had before. This community, the experiencer community and the circles of influence around it or near it have for a long time thrown numbers around, bandied all kinds of different numbers around in the millions. There's been millions and millions of people. I get frustrated that we throw numbers around so easily. Well, there's millions of abductees for this and millions of people who have experienced this and this. And while I do think it's likely or inevitable or, likely that millions of people and maybe billions of people around the world have experienced anomalous events, to Peter's point, I think the distinction between what is corporeal and what isn't matters, right? And not that one is more important than the other or one is more real than the other. I think what's clear here is that I think we're all starting to grok this, or a lot of us are, that our understanding of what reality is evolving along with this. Our understanding of physics is evolving along these lines. But the ontological implications of what was happening at the end of the 20th century in particular, and whatever distinctions it might have with what's happening now in terms of ongoing contact, matters from a scientific point of view. If we really want to understand whether or not there are any distinctions, and if there are distinctions, what are they? Then it behooves us to remove all of the researcher interpretations, including John Mack's interpretation, including whatever interpretation Whitley might have had, or eventually down the road, or Jacques, or if we can get, other researchers' materials as well. We want to take away their narrative about what this was and just surface the raw qualitative and quantitative data, the full phenomenology of what's on the table. And with that in mind, or with that approach, start to pull out of that very scientifically rigorous data that not only talks about, how many, to your point, Peter, how many different beings have been seen? Is it 5 or is it 50? Right? And what do they have in common? And of the beings, or of the meaning making that people, that experiencers pulled out of it over the course of time, what I personally care about most is the worldview shift. Like who was somebody at the beginning of this or before the encounters that they have? And then what happens for them as they go through, a relationship, an evolving relationship to what occurs. And where do we generally land? What's the fruit of the tree? If to your point, Peter, that I appreciate that you're saying that you want to initiate a new part of this dialogue. This is important. Who are the pilots? Who are the beings who are associated with these vehicles, right? And if we're going to take time to think about that, especially while, with the backdrop of national security threat and aviation safety, totally valid, as the dominant narratives, I feel like we already have an asymmetry in this cultural dialogue that we need to reconcile, that we need to correct, because the next questions that people come up with obviously are, well, who are they and what do they want? And the first answer right now in the space is, well, we don't know who they are. We don't know what they want. But we have thousands and thousands and thousands of documents in our archives from people who actually say we do know what they want because they've communicated it. Right? So that's what I want to do. I want to surface that data. Our team wants to surface that data so that we can have a much more informed, rounded conversation about this, the subject matter. I like how you call it the UAP subject. Is that what you said?
Well, I was saying the UAP problem because
the UAP problem.
It's both an intellectual and a social and a cosmological problem, and ultimately an ontological one.
Right.
And it has to be tackled, I think, from it's certainly not just an academic and scientific matter, and I think. For our audience, I hope you don't mind I'm jumping in.
Yeah, no, go for it. I'm happy to.
I think for our audience, is something to know is that, what you're seeing with Karin is somebody, I mean, this is too simple, but someone doing extremely strong advocacy work who recognizes that you actually need clean data, and not just clean quantitative data. It's actually, most of it's qualitative. Because, what the challenge for anyone doing research or journalism is like 95% of your data is junk because it's not actually data. It's rumors, it's tales. And it's not to say the tales are wrong or the rumors are wrong, but you don't get that off, you don't get that from the sources where most people get this stuff. And at the same time, apropos Karin's point, I'm not just trying to do this for academic purposes. I think that why you need certain kinds of academics or investigative journalists and so on, kind of on the scene with this, is you need people who not just who have been trained in research, but it's their vocation to do research, because our reputation as researchers is always on the line. When we say something's true, when we say something's false. And so we're very kind of self-regulating about what we're willing to say we think is the case or is probable or true. And that kind of can guard against misinformation. And it also helps us combat disinformation, which is very important here because, whatever the intent was, there was a lot of that.
But I agree.
Yeah.
Can I just add? Go ahead. Go ahead. Thing. Yeah. I just wanted to add to that and say you're so right too about the quality of academic or academics being involved in the process at all, or scientists. I can have a wish list, as I did, or a wish to have this research happen, and I could have sort of haphazardly undertaken it, but I was intuitively clear from the beginning that I wanted to pull in very competent academics who understood what it took to undertake a study like this. And it's night and day. It's night and day, the skill set, right? And it's night and day. Like, I have an idea of what needs to be done, but I'm also very clear when they're in the room that I just need to get out of the way, right? And that's not to minimize who I am or my motivation or heart for doing this, but I'm also not an academic, and I am not a researcher, an academic researcher, or a scientific researcher. And it's just been fascinating to have a front row seat at what the whole process entails and what it looks like when something is actually done very rigorously. And for me, it's deeply satisfying because it's like, finally, again, the word that keeps coming to mind is there's grounding here, because the data is being handled appropriately. Now, it doesn't mean that the data is going to tell us a story that we can wrap our minds around easily. I mean, that may still be its own thing, but at least we'll, between the work that you're doing and what we're doing here, we'll have something, as John would say, that we've given unto Caesar its due. We've put something rigorous into the dialectic that can be cited and referenced, and in future conversations and papers and editorials and that sort of thing. So and
go ahead, Peter.
I want to say something before we jump in. we took a long introduction here, I think, both to kind of clarify where we're coming from and to orient the conversation. But, in emphasizing research, the point is not at all to say that experiencers should not be trusted. The point is not to say experiencers are not often undertaking their own kind of investigation or inquiry, including an inquiry into themselves to figure out what's happened to them and the significance of it. The point is also not to say that researchers of any kind are going to have the full story and you need to listen to them. In fact, I think what Karin and I both want to do is precisely the reverse, which is to say that, and I really mean what I'm about to say, the experiencers are the people who need to be listened to with a very attuned ear, a very responsible ear, and a very, from grounded people who know how to turn their ear to something and not let it drive them crazy, because this is a subject which is very ungrounding and it can cause us to become very obsessed and we can lose our way. But I really think that, one of the downsides of the conversation of the last 6 years since 2017 is that we haven't really found a way in the different constituencies that compose the so-called UFO community to give experiencers the forum in which they can really speak, really be heard, and be taken very seriously. And I think as we jump into the AMA, what I would want to say, and this came up in a preparatory conversation for this AMA with Andrea, one of our moderators, is I want to say that experiencers should be very proud of themselves. And they should be very bold right now. And when they feel ready to take the risk of saying, hey, that happened to me. I may not want to tell you my full story, but that happened to me and it's real. And I know I'm not insane. I think it's time for that. I watched recently, as many people did, someone, let's just say coming out of government, very publicly say they were an experiencer in a sense. And it caused a lot of controversy because the announcement of that was, let's say it was a little sloppy. Okay. And I had to reflect and I thought, you know what? I can't judge that person and I will not judge that person because this is a bit like when people come out with respect to their sexuality or gender. And, imagine that we're in the 1960s and Stonewall hasn't happened. And you've got a bunch of closeted people who've had to be closeted for in order to protect themselves professionally, socially, even from violence. And they're looking right now, I think we're looking at people who are kind of coming out and saying, hey, okay, I'm just going to own that happened to me. I think we need to be very, very, very supportive of that and not get resentful or critical or judgmental, even if we don't always like the way it's done, because I don't think we're going to have the social dialogue we need to have about this in credible public settings and en masse across the country and around the world, unless we're really supportive of people when they do that. Even if we think sometimes, okay, that sounds a little kooky, or that might have been a bit much, or and then the flip side is, couldn't you say more? Couldn't you give us more because we want it? And so I really want to say that to the people who are gathered here for this, because I really think that it's up to a lot of you to push forward the dialogue right now, because unless people take that step to have courage to go ahead and say, hey, I don't even understand all of this, but this happened to me, and not just that I should be listened to, but I've got some insight here because of this. And so, in that spirit, as we're taking your questions, I certainly, and I know Karin too, and I know this about Leslie, who I know very well, like, we're learning from you. And I'm here in part to learn about the concerns of people so I can do a better job in my research, and Soul can do a better job in being responsive to not just what people want with this, but what they know and what their insights are.
Can I add to that a little bit? As an investigative reporter, First of all, I just want to say that I am so grateful to both of you for doing the kind of research-oriented work that you've both talked about, putting the personal, the second element of it that Peter was just talking about aside, about just the personal need for the experiencers, to talk about what's happened to them, but just this hardcore research, and you're both doing it. And it sounds like it may even be, completed at around the same times. I don't know. But for me as a reporter who knew John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and Dave Jacobs, 20 years ago, I have been so aware of the whole universe of the experiencer. And I've known so many credible, wonderful experiencers. And I've been involved, closely with some of the researchers. And I've always wanted to find a way to bring it forward, find a way that I could integrate it into my job as a reporter. And I have to be so careful always. I've had to be careful from the beginning for obvious reasons about what I could write about, because I was trying to reach the official world, trying to write every article I had. This was before 2017. I had to think, this is written for a member of Congress. What can you say to them to get them to read it? So obviously the experiencers could not be entered in. And I always found that very painful, because I as you've both been saying, I felt so deeply for them. I felt so much, not only for the struggles that they've had to go through, but also for the value of the information and the experiences that they had that can teach all of us, as you both said. So basically, I just want to reiterate that I'm totally understand where you're coming from. I can't wait for the time when I can report on this, which I think will come when you both complete your research. And I just think that's going to move this thing so forward, and it's going to help integrate that narrative, the experiencer element of this, with the broader narrative, which is something we all want to see happen. Maybe it'll start happening before that. I don't know, but I just wanted to let people know that it's not, as a reporter, I haven't been turning my back on this. I've been so in tune with it and wanting to find a way to bring it forward. And I'm just very happy that it looks like we're on the edge of that happening now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you're in your series, on the past couple of series that you've done, where you've had episodes that are about this, are helpful. That, it's very much puts it into the cultural discourse. And, we're very grateful. Leslie, you're iconic at this point, I expect very much that you'll continue to contribute to this dialogue, for as long as you're on the planet,
I want to. Yeah.
Yeah. And Peter, just the last thing, I agree with you about the word I used for what you were talking about is messiness. This is just messy, right? There's no way for it to not be messy. People are messy. I'm personally messy, even when I try not to be. It's just, and like you say, it's akin to coming out. And when people are coming out about something that's so profound, that has in its DNA this deep ontological, hate to say the term again, it's become so overused, but this deep ontological shock and this kind of almost traumatic worldview shift, we're messy in the way that we communicate it, and I think you're right that we just need to allow for that messiness to a certain extent, without, as you say, without judgment or criticism, that we'll get there. There are the great majority of the people who are in the experiencer community, like the vast majority, are reasonable, rational, normal human beings from all walks of life, right? Who are just trying to be as truthful as possible about something that happened. And we'll kind of lurch along, I think, as we go, but having compassion and empathy for each other as we move through this process, I think is always a good, compass heading, to align with. So that's my last.
That's great. And I think we should go on to some questions, because I think the Reddit users are probably eager to have their questions answered. This is from UFOB, and the user's name is DoCharge6901. This question is for everyone on the panel. Based on current knowledge, who is the person you feel has pieced together the most comprehensive idea of what the phenomenon is? Who wants to take that one on?
I think Peter should go first if he wants to. I'll follow.
Okay, I can start, and I'm gonna sound a bit like an academic right now, and I'll both say that's a good thing, and I'll also apologize for that because it's going to sound a bit critical. But I don't think anyone has a comprehensive view of this. Of course, I think the person who came the closest to it, but who would admit he was never able to capture it as a whole, if there's even a whole thing to capture, which I'll come back to, is Jacques Halley. Jacques is and was through his career an extraordinary researcher, both in the theory he developed of this, but often what's underappreciated is in the empirical, the evidence-based side of his research. He's extremely powerful, and that's the side of his work I really like. People forget that he covered a lot of ground. A book he wrote or published in the late 80s or early 90s called Confrontations. That's one that often gets forgotten when we're talking about Passport to Magonia or The Invisible College, which I think were his signal kind of breakthrough works. Confrontations is like the book in which he documents physiological and biological effects of UAP encounters. There's also a book called UFO Chronicles of the Soviet Union, which is completely forgotten, and it's full of incredibly, it's still today, extraordinary information, communications that he obtained from Russian experiencers as well as scientists who were effectively working in a classified UAP effort during the end of the Cold War. So as an empirical researcher and someone who comes out of computer and information science, who can see patterns that people often don't see, Jacques was absolutely extraordinary. I think the flip side of that is that the legacy of Jacques' work that we're still grappling with today, that I think needs to be addressed, or we need an alternative to. It's twofold. First, the idea that there's something called the phenomenon, and I think when Jacques said this, he knew exactly what he meant by it, which is that you can't just look at UFOs. There are a whole, as we all know, I won't rehearse it, there are a whole host of accompanying or related phenomena, whether it's both, from psi phenomena to bizarre animals to spiritual and religious conversions to visions that accompany, again, or related to UFOs. And he felt that this needed to be studied as a whole to even understand what UFOs were in the first place. I think the problem with that, what's been done with that, is now we have the idea that there's something called the phenomenon that it causes people to experience synchronicities and gives them so-called downloads and introduces strange events into their lives. And I don't know what we mean by that a lot of the time. It's a good shorthand for talking about people's experiences. But I don't think there's some master secret deceiving intelligence behind UAP that is manipulating and influencing us all the time. It's a bit like imagining imagine if you called it the God or you called it the entity. It would sound a little silly. And I don't mean to be critical. People use that language, but I think for research purposes, it's not serving us to just assume there's something called the phenomena. And to be very clear, Jacques was always attempting to be, or being reasonably clear about what he meant by that. And so we have to revisit his work and think about it. It's a very comprehensive theory. But I think we have to start to look at what the connection between the different elements of the phenomenon as he developed it or defined it are, and be very careful to not assume that these things go together in some kind of essential way or essentially tied to each other without doing more research using data to figure that out. And I have my own views about which things connect to each other. And what's intimidating about Jacques' work for me is not the theory so much. It's just that he covered so much empirical ground with data that he often knows how certain things are connected, and he's unable in the space of a book to explain why. So so that's one aspect of his work that I think is important, but I also think needs to be unpacked and addressed, and we need some alternatives. The other is, and here I'd be a bit more critical, but again, in with a lot of respect for how much Jacques contributed to our understanding of UAP. I think the other thing we have to address in his work is, can you really say that there's a large overlap or gray zone between the elves, fairies, let's say the undignified supernatural beings of medieval tales and folklore, of European myth, which was the hypothesis of Passport to Magonia. Can you say there's a gray zone between that and the UAP occupants? That's so big that you can't really separate the two. And that is, Jacques very clearly says in some of his work that if you get down to brass tacks, that you're dealing with the same thing. And I'm really not sure of that as an anthropologist. I'm really not sure of that from looking at some of the historical data that he uses that comes from the history of religion and from primary sources there. At the same time, I'm not sure from the research I do with experiencers about their experiences that you can really say these are the same things. We can come back to that, but I think that has to be addressed, because I think it's resulted in a lot of confusion when people use the term non-human intelligence. They mean many, many things by this, and I think for sorting out what's going on with UAP objects and vehicles, it's not helpful to imagine that it's all the same thing, whatever we're talking about. When we're talking about the minds that are somehow responsible for the UAP. So that's my way of answering that question. And I would like to say some things about John Mack and some others right now, but I want to, pass the ball now to Karin after that long answer. Sorry.
That's I like following you. You make my job really easy. You do the lion's share of the heavy lifting, and then I just come in and add a few things at the end. I agree with what you said, everything that you said there. I probably would have mentioned Jacques as well, although in the same breath and in the same sentence with some kind of punctuation would have said, and I think nobody has all of it. And I think that the weaknesses in some of the thesis. What's the plural for thesis?
Thesi. How about thesi?
Thesi. That there are gaps in all of them, including in John's. And I used to get in like full on proper intellectual arguments with John about this, that they would get a little bit warm. They'd get a little bit heated because he was so attached, especially towards the end, to this idea of a daimonic reality, a la Patrick Harper, and this is what you were speaking of. It's that elves and gnomes and fairies land. And that's not to say that those beings don't exist, or that they're not a part of, the human experience in some way. If that's true, that it's not an experience that I've had, but I'm not in any position to say that that's not real. It's probably based on something that happened to human beings. But I can tell you that for the 25-pound object, 25-poundish object being that was on top of me while I was in full waking consciousness, that's not living in daimonic reality. That entered and interrupted, came into my world, literally got in my face while I was, wide awake. So I think this is why I'm just putting ditto quotes around what you said, Peter. It's important to understand and get specific about what we're talking about. And I understand why we use the term phenomenon. Like you say, it's a catch-all phrase. It's a shorthand. It makes sense for us when we're talking about these things. But ultimately, we need to, I get back to that word grounding again. We need to ground what we're talking about, and we need to parse out the different aspects of it so that we can begin to understand what it's telling us about the universe that we live in, the nature of reality, the nature of physics, and the different kinds of beings that we're interacting with, and which ones are just consciousness and which ones of them penetrate into our world in a very physical way, or, do something in between. To me, this matters. I want that specificity. I want the clarity around it. So maybe there's an inner scientist in me that I didn't get to, educate or play out in this life. But, all I can do is just echo what you've said. So I think hands on the elephant. Short answer is there are a lot of different hands on the elephant. There are various different researchers who bring insight to specific parts of what we're studying here, what we're learning about, and nobody has a complete answer. And every researcher, including John, has flaws in their reasoning and rationale or their approach. That's what I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you both. That's great answers. Let's go to the next question. So this question is for Karin, and it's from the Reddit group Experiencers, and the questioner is Oak. Karin, as you worked so closely with Dr. John Mack and knew him at the time of his tragic death, would you be willing to comment and perhaps put to bed the rumors that his death was orchestrated in some manner?
Yeah, I would. I appreciate that question. I appreciate the opportunity to answer it. I'm one of the few people who has had access to the data and was there at the time, obviously, that the death occurred. So it drives me crazy, absolutely crazy, when I see comments under YouTube videos or wherever, with all of these conspiracy theories about John's death. It was an act of fate, call it what you will, that was heartbreaking for everybody involved, including the man, Raymond Chikowski, I think was his last name, who, as it turned out, was deeply traumatized by having found himself in the situation where he ended up hitting John and killing him. I spoke with the investigator of that. I don't want to call it the crime scene, the investigator of the accident on numerous different occasions while they were investigating it. I've read all of the reports from the witnesses. There were several different witnesses from different positions who saw what happened. And I knew the state that John was in before he left as well. He was very tired. He had been pushing and pushing and pushing himself. His eyesight was going, his neck mobility was going. And on that particular night, he was in very strange territory, not with anybody who, was accompanying him. He had had a couple of glasses of wine to drink. If he was someone who was not inclined to drive at night because his eyesight was going, wouldn't surprise me if there were some peripheral issues. I think he had a cataract or something that was making his ability to see properly, impaired. So there was a whole course of, these factors that were coming into play at the moment. And as someone who lived in London myself for a while, it's really, really easy to step into the street and almost have an accident. I have had on 2 occasions myself, people pull me back right as a car was coming by. The thing about John was that it wasn't just as he stepped into the first lane. So he made it across the first lane, okay. And it was as he stepped into the second lane. So really, in theory, there should have been time for him to notice it, but he was so looking the other direction, so completely looking away and not catching the light that was coming up because there was light nearby and he wasn't in the crosswalk, but near it. So just with this confluence of events, it happened so fast, he literally walked in front of the car. And he did it so quickly that the driver, Raymond, thought, and this is in the accident report, he thought that John had come from the left when John actually came from the right. Like Raymond could not process how it had actually happened. It just happened that quickly. And within an instant, the multiple people who had seen it, happen, sort of rushed over to John's aid and until help could be called. So Raymond ended up spending 6 months in jail for that. We knew that he encountered, PSD, he had PTSD from it. He was on three years for probation, I think, afterwards. And even before he got sentenced, I was one of the people with John's family who asked for leniency. That letter that was written, John's family wrote a letter to ask for leniency on behalf of Raymond, because we knew that's what John would have wanted. And it was just very clear to us that there was no reason to try to throw the book at him or to ruin the rest of his life. So the family had compassion for the man. I had compassion for him. And obviously it was a life-changing event for many people, including myself, to have John leave that way. But I don't think there's anything more disrespectful to the life that he lived than to throw that kind of conspiracy, ruminations or theories at it. It just undermines, what was a very traumatic, impactful exit of a life extremely well lived. And it's not deserving of the man, who left in that way. So that's what I have to say about
Thank you so much for saying that, Karin. Peter wants to add to it.
Yeah, I want to add something just really quickly that I think might shed light on even the idea that someone would have, as the question said, orchestrated his death, or we know UAP secrecy. I know this audience doesn't need to be told this, but in the United States government is real and longstanding. I would want to introduce a little perspective on that just very quickly, which is that you don't want to, it's a mistake to assume that some of the people working on that, and I'm just going to say broadly, the intelligence community, now that's a euphemism for a certain agency, but people working in the intelligence community on UAP at the time would have been against John Mack. It's been said to me more than once by people who had really strong careers in the intelligence community that the resources aren't there to properly study this. And that, meaning the entire UAP thing, but I think also what goes beyond UAP, what we're talking about today. And I suspect that Mack would have been seen by people working in government on UAP as a very welcome thing, because it was someone, it's not just a Harvard professor, but it's a really brilliant writer and psychiatrist who's looking at data that they were trying to look at. And I'm sure they were having just as much difficulty making sense of it. And I want to put that out there, not because I think there haven't been people keeping secrets who might have been doing it illegally or unconstitutionally, and maybe sometimes with bad intentions. But I think there's a whole other part of that where there are some very responsible people that felt that they were, who knew they were doing work on UAP and probably NHI in service to the United States government and as you would say in the intelligence community to the American people. And I want to share that perspective so that we have a sense that the view of someone like Mack and Mack himself would be completely the opposite, I think, of what you would imagine, where there were people who would have looked at him and said, God, we really need that. And it's too bad that, there's so much public skepticism of this, because we really need serious people on this and dealing with it in public. I mean, Karin's shaking her head. I wouldn't be surprised if he was told that at some point by someone from the intelligence community, because I've been told, there are people who would see the work you're doing as very, very important for their own efforts. And I've been told, look, those are good people in the sense that they feel a responsibility to their own government. They're ethical about the work they do. So I just want to complicate that picture, because it can lead us to think that picture of kind of only nefarious wrongdoing taking place, or any of that in the intelligence community, because I suspect that we have allies there. Those are just allies who can't tell us they're our allies, right? They're in classified environments, and this is a very, very secret subject. They can't go talk to scientists or experiencers about it without basically giving them security clearances and so on. And so there's a wall there, I think. And to, just wrap the point up, I think for that reason it'd be very unlikely that, they go and try to kill John Mack or something.
Makes no sense.
Yeah.
It just was so obviously not what happened. I mean, everybody knew who Raymond was in his community. He had been drinking shandies, throughout the day at this, not, what do you call it? I was going to say nonprofit, but that's not what I'm thinking of. But, he was donating his time throughout the day and had done it annually for years. So, there was, just wasn't that.
Well, I think you guys both put that one to bed very well. Thank you both. Let's go on to another question. So this question is for Peter from the UFOB Reddit group. It's from site staff. For Peter, how have the experiences of abductees changed over the decades? Are there notable trends or changes in experiences reported? And I'm going to assume that after Peter, maybe Karin's going to want to add to that as well.
Yeah, that's actually more a question for Karin. So let's pass that to her. And I know we're being a bit long-winded. No,
Let Karin take it.
Well, after I finish, I'd like to pass it.
Oh, yeah.
I want to say a quick word. Yeah, that is much more a question for Karin, but I do want to speak to the question in some way. I don't, presently seek out abductees per se in my research when I'm interviewing people. I get a lot of them, and I get a lot of abduction experiences reported or things that are like that. I think it's very important to look at reports and possible cases coming from people who've had abduction-like events that aren't abductions. And so I'm not going to point to a change. I'm going to point to some parallel things that have been neglected. So you have a lot of reports of what are called sometimes onboard experiences. And, they take a variety of forms, if we can classify them into forms, and a lot of them are not abductions at all. And a lot of them don't involve the alleged humanoids you associate with abductions. And so as we're thinking about what's changed over time in people's narratives and experiences, I want to put on the table that there are a bunch of parallel experiences that never get discussed in a lot of circles, and that we really have to look at. A lot of things don't fit that script, and I want us to start to think as researchers, but also in the UAP community itself about those.
Again, agreed. So I just picking up where you left off, I would say that, and so maybe working our way backwards, that I think this, post the turn of the century, there are encounters that people describe that I think align very much with the way Peter described it, these onboard kind of events, right? But they're, I think in the broadest sense of the term, in terms of like volume, like what we hear most often about during, since 2000 forward, is a lot more of a lot more about the downloads and telepathy and dreams and visions and events that are kind of a kinder, gentler nature. We don't hear about a new wave of abductees rushing over to various different researchers and hypnotherapists trying to find out what's in the black box of what happened to them the night before. That's not showing up right now. What happened before the turn of the century, moving back into the 60s, the 1960s, and maybe before, I don't know, is very much in alignment with that abduction narrative that we classically understand, that involves, the gray aliens showing up in people's bedrooms and taking people out of the room and, on board a ship, presumably an exotic curvilinear environment, wherein, gametes were removed and people were introduced to hybrids and, shown pictures that we would, just images of the Earth that we would relate to climate change now. We were given warnings like, look, humankind needs to get its shit together, essentially. Otherwise, this is what you're dealing with. And, and then they would find, people would often find themselves, instantly awake in their bed the next day wondering what the hell happened. So that narrative, that includes a lot of the little gray guys and that the physical removal and, the hybrid thing, I think our data is going to show very clearly that there's a precipitous drop off right at the turn of the century. So, we'll see if the data says something different. We'll report that. But I already what we can get a sense of it's pretty obvious. We've got some preliminary reports that suggest that it follows that pattern.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
Fascinating. We'll have another question now. This is from UFOB from Do Charge 6901. Is there anyone on the panel who may be able to share details on any obvious differences between the experiences of collective and group experiencers versus individual ones? Do groups tend to create better conditions for certain observations due to creating more energy together? Or is the phenomenon more likely to interact with individuals? Great question.
Yeah, I'm not the best one to answer that. All I could say is what I know from the community. We hear that when people go out as a group together, that they tend to be more successful. I think that gets into Skywatcher's territory and other, and maybe even Greer's work that he's done with CE5 back in the day. I know the least about that, if I'm being perfectly honest. I'm a little hermit that's just, quiet and got my head down, working behind the scenes. I don't know. Peter might have, more informed opinions about that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think they're going to be opinions in the sense that let's start and say that I don't think anyone has done research in a scientific or social scientific sense that would, could answer that question. And I don't say that to say it's not a good question. It's actually a very good question. I will say, and this is anecdotal, that I'm aware of, I know of one experience that took place in New York after an event I spoke at, and I'll just kind of got to leave it at that. I'm sure there's somebody here. I wouldn't be surprised if there was someone here who was part of it, where a group of people all experienced missing time the same evening after an event. And I find that very interesting, given what they were gathered, it was a UAP event that they were attending together. And certainly we had all sorts of reports from the Soul Symposium of anomalous things happening. And I talked to a very, smart woman in San Francisco here last night who showed me footage of a UAP that a group of people saw at our symposium. And it's a pretty, I remember them watching it and being unable to join them and thinking I might be missing something good here. But the video shows, it's a light, but there seems to be some distortion of the light that would conform to what you would expect to happen if there was something taking place with gravity or space time. It looks like a cinematic image of a black hole a bit. So it's a really interesting image, unless I'm deceiving myself on that. But all that's to say that I am aware just professionally of some strange things that have happened to groups at events that I've been at. I want to answer the question, I think, a little more responsibly as a researcher and say, well, let's take, a 50,000 foot view of this and step back a bit. UAP tend not to interact with groups. Like they don't interact with society as a whole generally. They don't interact with cities. They don't interact with towns. We know we have examples of that, like the Farmington, New Mexico incident in the late 40s, early 50s, where for a weekend, a small New Mexico town reported seeing something like an air show or fleet of UAP for a 2-day period. But I think what we know is that for whatever reason, interaction with individuals is what's taken place. Much more than anything where we've had displays where even, dozens of people see things simultaneously. I think we should all ask ourselves, what's the reason for that? I know the hypothesis is out there that happens because UAP are fundamentally, the idea is that they're displaying themselves in order to influence human consciousness. And I think there might be something to that. But at the same time, we have to consider that if we really have occupants, as people report, and the occupants are in some sense products of evolution, even if they transcended it a bit through technology, they may have their own reasons for stealth, for camouflage, for being withdrawn, for not showing themselves too much, especially if their own, if whatever's taking place with UAP vehicles is commensurate enough. I mean, it's of the same kind as our own reality. They may have their own kinds of economic or political imperatives. This is all hypothetical, but I think there may be a reason that you have a lot of effectively one-to-one interaction taking place. I don't think anyone knows this in a solid sense, but that's my answer to that.
The only thing I would add to that is safety. I felt like that's the only.
I was going to say that
was missing. That we're lethal. If there are some actually physically real beings there, as we understand that there are to some extent, then the asymmetry between our physical capabilities and theirs, in close proximity is dangerous to them. So, I think that they hide out for all kinds of reasons. As I like to quote Mike Masters, we're drunk monkeys juggling chainsaws.
Right. And the more evolved our technology becomes, the more at risk they are. I was just thinking back when you mentioned that case, Peter, to the Phoenix Lights, which was in 1996, I believe, 97. And that to me is sort of like the last case, at least in this country, where, there were multiple UAP in one area for an hour and a half that night, and hundreds of people saw them. So that was kind of a display to when you said not to a city or a town, to a large number of people at once. But I can't really think of anything since, and it may be that I was just thinking of what Karin said. We tend to be, our military is all focused on national security and those kinds of things, and the technology, and we want to capture it, and we want to develop it, and we want to back engineer it. And boy, we'd like to have one of those craft, Mm-hmm. So it may be that, it wouldn't be wise for them to engage in any other way except through individuals. Although, as you point out, they've been doing that for a long time. So maybe that wasn't their initial reason, but it's a really interesting question, because people say, why don't they land on the White House lawn? We're sort of talking about the same kind of question. Although I think the questioner was asking more about whether the energy of multiple people is more effective than a single person. And certainly with people who go out in the field, like the Skywatcher people, they put energies together of groups of people if they're trying to attract the objects. But that's a different thing from the objects or the UAPs coming in and themselves initiating contact with individuals. So it's messy, like you said earlier, Karin.
It's messy. It's all messy.
I wish we had more solid answers for these questions, but they're great questions. So how about we have another one now? So this is again for everyone from HighStrangeness. From the user name is Girl of 100 Lists. Do experiencers heightened psi abilities such as telepathy, precognition, and healing, along with orb witnesses' reports of consciousness-related interactions, suggest a deeper relationship between human consciousness and non-human intelligence, possibly revealing an undiscovered mechanism linking consciousness and physical reality? Wow, what a great question.
Can I start with that one?
Please.
And Peter, do you mind?
No, go for it, please.
Yeah, I'll start from the experiencer, and then I'll start micro, personal, and you can go meta. Very much the phenomenon, speaking from personal experiences. And so for those who don't know, I'm the classic abductee from the back end of the 20th century. So that means someone who had conscious interactions with beings that left me with explicit memories that do not require hypnosis to recall. And in the course of having those encounters, I think one of the most disruptive, if not the most disruptive elements of it, is this crash course in how the universe operates in its fullness. And that's not to say that I can grok what is happening in its fullness. It was just the place where physical reality and consciousness collapse into wholeness. All right, and that in a moment, as Jeff Kreipowitz likes to talk about the flip. So in a moment, there's a flip. So as human animals, we think the physical world is primary, and we operate from that belief system. The phenomenon as it occurred. Sorry, I hate to use that word. The interactions with the direct contact encounters that I had in the 90s were very, very much physically demonstrated this holistic consciousness first kind of panpsychism, I think. And it was brain breaking for me, because that's not the worldview that I was raised in. I was raised, Southern Baptist, conservative and hardcore physicalist. So there's this period of time where the brain, and speaking personally, where the brain was wrestling with, this is very clearly, obviously happening. That part of my brain saying, I recognize that this is a real event. And the other part of my brain saying, but it can't be, because it can't happen. And the only moment where I was truly suffering in it psychologically was at the apex of the tension between those two conflicting realities, those two conflicting understandings. And it wasn't until I had a couple, but one very specific real encounter that I referenced earlier, that I was so awake, and I was intentionally awakened so I could be awake for it, that finally that part of me that was wrestling with this can't happen, collapse into, oh, this is happening, and this is actually how the universe functions. I can't explain it. I can't write up the math for it, but I now understand and function with the universe as a holistic experience where consciousness is the seat of my core identity rather than my physical body with my brain. So that's how I would answer that. Do you want to go meta with that from there, Peter?
I think for interest of time, I won't, except to say that, I think we all, I'll go maybe broader about data, qualitative data, and, people's, narration of their own experience like yours. I think everybody here knows that UAP and close encounters with humanoids or occupants, or even dreams about them and so on. To put it in a fun way, they tend to be kind of gateway drugs to like it's a spiritual experience. And I know many people that in a sense started with that kind of thing, who went on to have very serious religious practices where they're not focused on UAP or in a popular sense aliens, and they consider that kind of it was something that stimulated them to get somewhere. And I think we have to remember that that's probably a true statement generally, that this is, in the time we live in, a way to that people become more serious about religious practice, religious experience. And I think I think that's a very interesting and curious thing. We need to understand it better. I think we also need to be, I think we need to be cautious, though, in accepting, and I think Karin will very much agree with me about this, accepting the idea that therefore, what's between pure consciousness in an infinite sense, as you would postulate it in certain kinds of Hinduism or Buddhism or the mystical traditions of monotheism, between that and the idea that reality is simply physical, and there's nothing else past the body and materiality. In between there's this problem of like, okay, what are these things? What are the vehicles, and what are the who are their designers and operators? And I think the extraterrestrial hypothesis has it's really too bad that has been treated as I understand why it was criticized in the 1980s and 1970s, but it's too bad that it's become seen as kind of a lowbrow position on this, because we should be very excited to learn that maybe there is life in other parts of the galaxy, and that UAP may have come from living beings. That's an exciting thing. And that is absolutely not incompatible with the idea that consciousness, or I would say thoughts, might have a strong degree of autonomy from physicality in the body as we conceive it, or even be primary. One thing I notice, and I can elaborate if the questions go here, in my own research, both with existing published or collected reports of close encounters, as well as my interviews with people who've had extraordinary encounters often, is that people are encountering at once a very strange and foreign kind of body, and they're encountering a very powerful and intense consciousness that to some extent they discover they're continuous with, but is still located or gathered around an individual or a group of individual beings. And I think one way we might imagine thinking about that, or we might try to interpret that, is that, look, and I'm speaking, for academics out there, or for people who are skeptical of this, I'm speaking in a colloquial sense. If there are aliens, the data would show us that they are beings of body, as much as they are of mind, but they may understand mind much better than us. If we, those of us who meditate, have religious practices and so on, that involve cultivating awareness of how we are consciousness, not just that we have consciousness. We often perceive that it's not that there's some kind of evolution that needs to take place that would give us, a greater power of consciousness. It's just that we're very, very unaware of it. And we may be dealing with beings, provided that they're really there. Again, I'm not claiming we know that, but we may be dealing with beings that simply are much, much more aware of the fact that they are consciousness, and they are able to exist there and act there much more than us. And I think that's an important point to reflect on for people who are having experiences or trying to think them through. That may be what's going on. And I think if I'm on the right track with that, I think it's a tremendously interesting thing to discover. And it could help us tremendously in understanding ourselves. And I think that's not a point that needs to be made from within specific religious traditions only. It's also not something that should only be done through science. If that's true, we were really to grasp that about consciousness, it would give us new kinds of knowledge that are neither religious nor scientific. I think we see those things emerging today kind of awkwardly, where people don't know what to call them. It's really exciting if you think about that.
Can I just link on real quick to that? One of the first thoughts that occurred to me as I was confronted with this physical being that was on top of me was that its body seemed exceedingly small for how broad and strong its consciousness was. Like, it was almost like there was this small weight, like the body was this small weight that was just serving as this light anchor for what was this massively superior intellectual and consciousness-based, like quantum computing type, intelligence. It was, even though I was bigger and stronger, I felt like a dumb animal in its presence. And that's not being critical of animals with lesser intelligence. I adore animals and think they deserve everything that human beings have a right to have here. But I just felt stupid, and I felt very much contained in my body compared to the consciousness that this thing was.
Wow.
So inferior. It was profound. Again, I keep using the word asymmetry, but that was very much there. And to your point about, what is the nature of it? This is one of the data points that we're actually trying to get at in the research that we're doing is that there has been communication from these beings repeatedly about the nature of consciousness and what humankind is in relationship to that, and what they're encouraging us to understand about ourselves. When Donald Hoffman and another physicist talk about this idea that we have evolved for fitness up to this point to be able to perceive the world as it exists now, because that's what gets us to the next day and helps us stay alive long enough to make babies and continue to continue the species. I think that we're at this pivot point, maybe a vanguard or something of humankind's beginning to wake up to this idea, beginning to understand that we are something much, much larger with a much greater capacity and much greater sensitivity, that's capable of receiving a lot more data that's out there in the universe than we have been able to up until this point. And I think, the telepathy tapes are an excellent example of what we're trying to talk about there. So, I mean, we that's mostly what I wanted to say, other than just, again, I agree with your points, Peter.
All right, next question. This is from UFOs, FlipsnGiggles. I like these names. This is for Karin. Could some experiencers be individuals with innate but untrained psionic abilities? If so, how might this shape our understanding of their encounters and their role in contact phenomena?
This is the chicken and the egg question, right? So I had encounters when I was a kid up until the point that I was 8 that I couldn't make sense of. They just lived inside of a box I put inside the closet of my psyche and left them there. And if you had asked me between 7 or 8 years old and till I was 25, and the encounters happened again as an adult, if you had asked me, did I think I have any telepathic or psi abilities, I would have thought that was a ridiculous question. And yet I found myself doing research. I used to write, I wrote papers on telepathy for school. And when I was going to the bathroom, I would look at the toilet paper roll and I would, as a teenager, I'd see if I could get it to unroll in front of me. I was like, I don't know where that stuff came from, but I didn't demonstrate any particular, talents as a child. And then when the encounters started happening as an adult, all of this psi phenomena, I don't know what you call it, the suite, SUITE, of skills or experiences just came flooding in along with all the direct contact encounters. And that, frankly, was as traumatizing in the moment as anything else. Because my worldview didn't accommodate or allow for that kind of psi phenomena to exist. And so that was something that I had to get used to over the course of time. And now, of course, I feel quite facile in whatever psi talents or skills that I have, and feel quite relaxed around them. But it took, it's taken the better part of 3 decades for me to find a quiet, relaxed space around it. So all to say, I think that many, many, many experiencers would talk about having, these various psi abilities, and you would probably have to speak to each one individually to get their personal opinion on whether or not they felt like they were always that way, or that the psi, capacities, emerge as a result of their direct encounters. It may be just, I think maybe the easiest way to say it is that we all probably have these latent abilities, and that there are certain experiences or events in life that can trigger or awaken them. And then it's just kind of like a muscle in the gym. Once you know where it is and you understand, like the brain wires for it, or you relax into it, then it's like, oh, it's accessible to you. And once you see it, you can't kind of unsee it or start experiencing it. It's there. So that's how I would respond to it.
Great. Shall we go to the next question? To the group. This is from HighStrangeness, Girl of 100 Lists. Dr. John Mack and the FREE, Free Experiencer Research Study, both documented how UAP encounters often lead to profound transformative experiences for individuals, including shifts in worldview, spiritual awakening, and a heightened sense of interconnectedness. In Passport to the Cosmos, Mack wrote, "More important is whether the abduction process brings about genuine growth or might even be intended or designed to do so by whatever intelligence is at its source." How do you interpret these transformative effects?
I'll follow Peter on this one.
Thanks, Karin. I know you have a lot to say about that, so I appreciate that. I'd want to say I think that it sure sounds like this is true based on the research the John Mack Institute is doing now and that Karin is leading, but she'll speak to that. I want to point out, I think that with a lot of other kinds of encounters, it's clear that's going on sometimes, but it's also clear that it may not be going on. I'm talking right now in my research, and it's happening, every day, sometimes multiple times a day, to people who've had very diverse kinds of experiences. And I'd say briefly that we do see people who have what seem to be chance encounters. They also seem to have encounters that may not exactly be orchestrated, where that doesn't happen. And I can think of, and I'm not saying this to throw cold water on that, because I think, Karin has convinced me there's some truth to this. It's not just in John Mack's writing itself, to what you identified in the question. Excuse me, it sounds like there's going to be a little noise from the window as I'm speaking. I have a case I'm writing about of a woman who is in her mid-80s now, who had a really remarkable hour-long observation of a UAP near Mount Rainier in 1952, 11 years old. And then in her late 40s, she had a kind of truncated abduction experience, in which she reports not being taken, but seeing so-called grays in her bedroom, and also having, sorry for the noise. I was told this wasn't picking up on my mic when we checked, and I can't get up to go to the window to stop that. But, there were so-called grays present in her bedroom. And then a taller individual she described as a normal man who approached her, and she reports, spoke to her telepathically and said, we didn't find what we were looking for. We won't be coming back. And there wasn't anything more to the experience. And I find that interesting, not because I'm trying to say it contradicts or should be taken as contradicting other data, but we know cases where not much happens to the person after they have the event, and the transformation of their self-understanding or their understanding of reality can be much more of the "we are not alone" variety. Now, Karin may step in and say, well, that's precisely because it was truncated, or there weren't enough events, and that's where it leads generally. But I just want to leave some space open for the idea that we may have a lot of things going on that are not not designed necessarily to be pedagogical in that sense or to lead us into some kind of conversion. At the same time, I've interviewed people who've had, if they took place, as I think they did, absolutely remarkable onboard encounters that were clearly designed to affect their consciousness, among other things.
If we're playing volleyball, you're setting them up, and or I don't know, you're just easy bunts out for pop flies out to center field. I agree with all of that, and I would add to it that, for the entire spectrum of human emotional intelligence that exists out there, and for the full spectrum of capacity that various different, human beings have or don't have to metabolize very challenging events. I think there's something very personal, sometimes about whether or not, somebody comes into an evolved worldview around it. It could be that person is not wired to release into this idea of some broader concept of what permissions are. If we're talking, let's say, for instance, about an abduction event, very often people think, well, I gave permission for this, in some pre-life existence. Well, that works out well as a framework if someone's aligned with that kind of worldview. But if someone doesn't align with that worldview, and it's very much anchored in who they are, fairly so, like that's reasonable to be anchored in their identity as a human being, then if someone's autonomy is violated, then that's enough to piss somebody off. I mean, that's very threatening. Our pets get really annoyed with us when we put them into a pet carrier to take them to a vet. They don't know what's going on. They don't like it. So I'm not sure that their worldview, collapses open to accommodate the larger reality of what's happening to them in those events. They just want it to be over and get back to home as safely as possible. So there are many different factors that play into, whether or not somebody comes out of these experiences with a transformed consciousness and worldview. I make a prediction. We'll see if it turns out to be right. That I think we're going to find that somewhere around 80% or more of our abductees or experiencers talk about that transformed worldview, that does seem to be a part of at least what was being communicated or conveyed or encouraged during that, abduction flack, at the back half of the 20th century. But that doesn't mean that everybody gets there. And it doesn't mean that somebody has failed as a result of, if they haven't gotten to some transformed worldview. I think, again, a lot of it's personality. When the experiences were happening to me, I was deeply traumatized and terrified to begin with, and had very violent thoughts, originally, like when I saw one of these things in my room, I'm not understanding what it was. I just thought, be very frank, if you come any closer to me, I will fucking kill you. That's not enlightened. There's nothing enlightened about that, right? That's just hardcore survival. But by the time 3 or 4 years later that, the whole process was wrapping up, I was leaning in. I really wanted to understand what was happening, and I wanted to try to not be afraid, and I wanted more out of the relationship. I was increasingly trying to make it bilateral, and trying to understand, exactly what was happening, what was being offered to me. But that's sort of how I am as a person. I lean in, in life when life gets hard and frustrating, and I'm a fighter. So I think we have to allow for everybody's different kind of responses to it, and withhold judgment. That's back to a point that Peter made early on. Like, we need to not be in judgment. If somebody doesn't come to a place where it's all love and light, that's okay. That's reasonable. That's fair. And we need to be with somebody, an experiencer, and be present with them in that, and allow for the reasonableness, the fairness of someone having that kind of encounter. So there's a lot of unknowns here, and we'll just learn more about things over the course of time.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people, and I especially got to know a lot of these people when I was close to Bud Hopkins, because he sort of attracted this group of people that were basically traumatized and terrified, and really saw their experiences as negative. And they were not into this kind of transformation that we're talking about. But I think, as you sort of alluded to, that over time, even the people who are terrified wish this had never happened to them, totally freaked out like any normal person would be, seeing this being in their bedroom that they think is going to kill them, right? Over time, it seems like sometimes the transformation part takes years and years and years, but eventually most people sort of get some of that. It just takes a while. That's been my experience and people I've talked to. So, but of course, everybody's reaction is going to be different.
Peter, did you have something?
I was only going to say that, I'll say it quickly because I think we have a lot of questions, or I'll try to say it quickly. I think that it may be, and again, I really have to add a lot of provisos to this as a researcher. If what we understand the data to show, and if our assumptions are correct about this, then I can say the following. It may be that the encounter with another embodied or apparently embodied being that has a much more developed relationship to its own consciousness, that might by itself be transformative. That might be a trigger for something. Imagine it, to draw a very loose analogy, if you had been illiterate until 40 in a society without writing. And I'm not saying it's good to have writing or bad. In fact, I know as an anthropologist, societies that don't have writing often have absolutely profound other ways of encoding thought and cognition. It doesn't happen in writing. But imagine that you're in a society without writing, you're illiterate until you're 40, and you're suddenly thrust into a context in which literacy is presumed, reading is presumed, and there's a mode of consciousness that goes with it. And consciousness often doesn't just mean thought is everything, awareness is everything. It's not a Advaita Hinduism. Sometimes consciousness means, in philosophy, it often simply means self-awareness and also a presence to your own perception. That you are perceiving. There's a perceiver with perception. It's also a capacity to narrate yourself, account for your own experience, to plot history as a society. But literacy allows for a different kind of consciousness, and you could suddenly be confronted with it, learn to read in a year or two, and your cognition is transformed. And I think we might be overlooking that. That's why I said I don't know that it's all designed and orchestrated for this, because many of the things, and I'm not trying to, I'm in no position to comment on the research you guys are doing, Karin, but it could be that many of the things you guys are looking at, while there might be some intent for that to happen among the person, to the person who's having the experience, it might actually be, much more just an effect of the experience or the encounter. I don't think we should dive into that and try to.
Yeah, there's a couple. I don't disagree with you. There's a couple things. I know we need to move on to the next question, but I want to link. I'll try to do it very quickly. I agree with you again, and I think you're absolutely correct I think the analogy is perfect. As I was trying to articulate, even about my own experiences, just the very moment of being faced, like being in the presence of a being with this very, very well developed, intelligence and consciousness. Like you said it perfectly. I can't quite grab it, but it's aware, it's consciousness. It understands the relationship of consciousness to reality, and it's embodying this, right? So just being in the presence of something like that is itself a call. It's an invitation. All right. It's like, so again, the human mind racing, trying to go, what is this? And how do I meet it? How do I receive it? How do I be in this? Because this is very different than how I am next to a normal human being, which is one of the things I always talk about. Like, people think, oh, I want to meet an ET. And we have this imagination that we're thinking about ET out, of the Steven Spielberg type. But that's not what's going on here. As, the Jake Barbers of the world, can tell you, there's something profound profound that enters in and engages and transforms in an instant. So in terms of the intention, there are definite narratives that show up that we will surface, so that, that they plain to see of various kind of communications that the beings were trying to make clear. Not necessarily so much about, look, you guys need to change your consciousness. It's more like you need to change your relationship to this idea of who you are in relationship to the world around you, to life around you, the sense of interconnectivity, the sense of like all life is, we'll use the word sacred, but it's more subtle than that. So we'll surface the narratives in the research, and we'll get a sense for how they were trying to communicate lessons that were important to it. At least that they thought that the lessons were important for us to learn or to know about.
Yeah, Peter.
I'm going to add one thing here because I think the audience will appreciate it. And it's a provocation to think. I've often pondered those sorts of messages, especially when they concern ecology and means.
Yeah.
And I've compared them to the messages missionaries gave in the context of colonization. We need to be clever and imagine that even if we're receiving a message that suggests to us that we need to attend to our environment, be better people, understand the interconnectedness of life and so on, it's not necessarily beneficial to us. We may make it beneficial to us, but it may not, I'll put it another way, may not be beneficent. It may be very, very, very interested in ways we don't understand. And that's where we as we unpeel the different layers of this, we may discover that we still have to be very critical in the face of something that requires us to suspend being critical and to be very, very open.
I don't disagree with that. And one of the ways that I think that's an honest intellectual argument. And if someone is being intellectually honest, then we have to allow for that as a possibility. I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to unpack and surface the full narratives that exist inside of these experiencer stories and the transcripts and the letters that are available to us. And it's like what would give somebody an idea that at least some of these beings actually do care that we move in a positive direction, to paraphrase. And it has to do with with narratives that they have repeatedly said that, look, we are you. So this gets into are they our future descendants or some beings who had a parallel reality and that we've reached the end of our biological, what's the word? The ability to biologically procreate, right? We're no longer vital in that way. And so we need this DNA in order to reinvigorate our own. And again, this is, when you talk about taking something, you can't have this on YouTube. This is in the realm of like, we'll see, right? Let's just like asterisks around this. But if this turns out to be a possible truth or possible reality, if these were beings who had already in some way played out the evolutionary hand all the way to the end, reached some kind of conclusion that was, pretty stark, meaning, no longer biologically viable, and also had somehow damaged their own planet, or their own environment, living environment in some way, and were trying to, convey the message, like, if you guys don't respond now, then you're looking at this potential future outcome. That is common. That narrative is common amongst abductees. And the question becomes, well, does that imply that those beings are actually our future descendants and they've figured out they've cracked time travel, or they're just, again, there's some adjacent life form? Or to your point, are they just saying this, right? Are they saying all of these things to create this kind of neutral or positive interior environments for us psychologically, so that humans behave in a certain way that we create an outcome that's beneficial to them? I don't think any of us have any real way of answering that question right now. All I can ask myself is, how do I feel as a human being when I feel that I'm interconnected to everything? When I recognize that empathy and compassion are the grounding principles of my life, and how do I feel when I look around and think, okay, we're all in this together, and what can we do to be cooperative rather than competitive? How do we help each other out? To me, I think the world that we create from that zeitgeist, that worldview, is far better than the one that we create, when we're operating out of our primal kind of biological drives. But that's personal opinion, subjective, and we'll see how it all unfolds.
And go on to the next question. Thank you for that. This is for Peter from our Reddit Aliens. It's from FlipsnGiggles. Peter, considering your work on pluralism, cosmology, and translation, do you think ancient shamans, mystics, or experiencers might have been accessing a kind of library, a collective consciousness or non-local source of knowledge to interpret contact experiences?
Okay, I don't know how to answer that. I think in the terms of the question, so I apologize if I kind of take it in a slightly different direction. I'll answer it as best as I can. I first have to say, or I wouldn't be responsible as an anthropologist. Anthropologists are not ever, and I'll tell you why in a second. We're never going to say that there's a big universal spiritual knowledge or tradition that is associated with shamans, and that they're ancient. This is very close to the idea that indigenous people in the Americas preserve in their souls today some essential way of life that we've forgotten, and we as whites or other ethnicities should go to them and learn the ways of nature and so on. And this kind of stuff is very offensive to Native Americans and First Nations people in Canada and so on, not because they don't have very vital, insightful, and they themselves would say much more ecologically minded religious and cosmological traditions, but we have a very kind of distorted view of what those are, and we often assume that they're the same things as what people in ancient Egypt thought, or what some pious Buddhist monks in Tibet think, and so on. And I'm not saying there's not overlap and so on, but we're extremely careful about not talking that way, because it's not intellectually responsible of us. We know about really the diversity of human traditions and how they're not all the same, and it's just a matter of study for us. But we also know that anthropologists had a very ambivalent relationship to colonialism in the first half of the 20th century. They were often, anthropologists, to get their work done, were often very close to the British or French civil service that were responsible for the administration of the colonies. And so, they were actively involved in or close to the maintenance of colonialism, which, I'm sure some people here, or some people that could listen to this in the future, are going to accuse me of being politically correct or woke or something. But colonialism was a very, very, very violent project. It's not separable from slavery. It's not separable from very, very asymmetrical kinds of economic exploitation. And it's not separable from the destruction of the kinds of cosmologies and traditions that the questioner is asking about. So I have to be ethical as an anthropologist, say all that before I answer the question. But here's what I have to say. The question's about pluralism, and I am a pluralist, both politically and intellectually. What does that mean? Among other things, pluralism is the idea that if there is something like absolute truth, it's really not in human power to rationally force everyone or prove to everyone that you know what it is. there have been attempts to, secure truth in philosophy that just don't work out. You can have a perfect argument, but people can always remain skeptical to it. They can always have counter argument. And so it can be a much smarter position to decide that not in a loose, absolutely relativistic way, but a variety. It's better to assume that a variety and diversity of human perspectives have their validity. And I don't mean in a vague, willy-nilly sense that you can never have truth of any kind. I certainly don't mean the New Age idea that I have my truth, and then I start talking about my truth when I'm in a dispute with my significant other or something. I mean something more serious, which is that if you move from say some traditions of indigenous people in the Americas to certain strains of Buddhism to Taoism. To cultures that we don't recognize as having vital religious or cosmological traditions, but do. Truth looks different. As Pascal said, what's true on this side of the Pyrenees, by which he meant France, is different than what's true on the other side, which was Spain. There is relativity with truth, and I don't mean that in the sense of that you would get from relativistic physics. We have our own way of theorizing relativism in anthropology, which doesn't require talking about physics. It has to do with comparing traditions and seeing that just to make sense of how they might have insider truth, you have to have an active comparison. Well, if you have an active comparison between your own culture and another, you don't have a transcendent or overview position from which to make sense of the things you're comparing. You can construct one on the basis of your own assumptions, but you're not going to be able to subtract a bunch of your assumptions, which are very embedded in place, which you could say society, and time, which is history. Another way of saying this is that anytime we want to make sense of the differences between historical periods or cultural formations, we really have to look at them together and look at there are points of commonality, there are points of difference, but anthropology would be a science that tries to get an overview, but we know very well that our overview is still bound in place and time. So where I'm going with that is I think pluralism is then the best way to deal with the differences, because you don't try to assimilate them quickly to the idea that there are universal truths and that just because your tradition tells you that certain truths are universal, that they are. You want to always look for the differences, and you'll know better how your own tradition gives you, let's say, some purchasing power as it goes to others to say, okay, we know that you might have anticipated our truths, but you still want to really step back and say, okay, we really don't know what might be universally valid. Okay, so that's a long, I know, very intellectual way of kind of getting at the point here, which is that if there are multiple traditions, they don't add up into a common whole. How are they dealing with UAP events and possible encounters with NHI differently? I think they're dealing with it differently. And I don't mean the pop idea that we think there are spaceships and they, whoever they are, see the real truth because they're closer to nature or God or something. I actually think there's evidence, very serious evidence, that there are cultural dispositions today that make it easier for people to process in waking life encounters they're having with UAP or so-called NHI. I think the best evidence for what I just said comes from Artie Six Killer Clark's books, in which she was a Native American education scholar at Montana State University, I believe, who recently died. But she collected thousands of close encounter of the third, fourth, fifth kind narratives from American Indians, First Nations people, Mesoamerican indigenous people. And one striking thing about those is that you see a lot less fear in those encounters from the people reporting them. When they recount the event, it's often, there's astonishment, there's surprise, but there's a much more calm acceptance of what's going on. And I notice as well, much clearer perception of what's taking place and a better understanding of what's trying to be communicated. And I see some very striking differences between those accounts and things that we get, not just in abduction narratives, but other kinds of narratives that come from Europe and North America, where people are encountering a landed vehicle and they see a being. And one of those differences is that the communication, it's, if there's something like a communicational exchange, it's a lot more lucid on the human end, both in terms of being understood and what's and the message given back is often more intelligible as well. And you can look at those works and you see there's something like conversations taking place. And I'm not of the school that says, well, the NHI are deceptive, so you can't trust the perceptions of the witnesses. I mean, we'd get nowhere with research if we thought that. And I also don't think all the communications are just symbolic. You see some very kind of basic communications taking place. I'll give an example. She recounts the story of a guy operating a snowplow in Alaska, an indigenous guy, during a winter storm, who, while he's plowing a interstate or a state highway, he encounters a landed UAP vehicle. It's night. He thinks at first he's seen a truck that has kind of ended up perpendicular on the road. He approaches it and he realizes it's a proverbial landed disc. And he's shocked, and the thing quickly takes off. But before that happens, he notices something like a gray in front of the vehicle. Now, as the story goes, the next thing he knows, the gray is in the cab of his truck right next to him after the vehicle leaves. And he's shocked, and he says, and he hears, he hears in his head the words cold, cold, cold. Well, that's a very physical claim, and that's a living being would be worried about cold, or a being that at least has to be concerned with self-preservation, even if we don't understand what its relationship to its body is. But they have an exchange in which the trucker expresses surprise that somehow this thing popped into his truck, and the things, if all this is true, the being says to him, well, you humans could do this too. You just don't understand yourselves well enough. This is not, and it is basically conveyed to him, it's not magic or anything. I find that very interesting as a data point. Again, if the event happened, which is a problem with these things. I find additionally very, very interesting that during the exchange, the being says something to him like, we've never understood it. The being kind of observes the cab and asks him some questions about the engine, something like that, and says, we've never understood why you didn't develop magnetic technology yet. I found that to be very, very fascinating, because it blows the idea that what's taking place involves no curiosity on the other end. That you're dealing with beings that are so far beyond biological existence and technology that they're just avatars that are sent here to trick us, or are coming out of some other kind of existence which is absolutely incommensurate with ours. You see that there may be some parity between us and them there. And to go back to the point of departure here, I do think that does have something to do if all these narratives are true in the way I think they are, and I trust currently that Clark was a good investigator, and that she wasn't leading the witness, she wasn't getting delusional narratives and so on. So I think these things probably happened. I think that you still had, at the time she was doing research, I don't know if this is the case now, a lot of Native American people who were not socialized as children into a strong distinction between the visible and the invisible, between a world you can see and a world you can't see. And I'd additionally say in a distinction, not socialized into a distinction between humans as the sole possessors of consciousness and other beings, physical or not, that also have consciousness. And I think not being socialized that way, my hypothesis is that it actually makes it easier to experience these things because at a kind of a baseline unconscious cognitive state, you're not operating with the idea that there is like minimal animacy, sentience, and consciousness in the universe. You're assuming there's a lot of it. And so when you see something strange that seems to be conscious, you're able to accept it. And additionally, if you don't think that there are a bunch of invisible things that will never enter perception, that they can enter, you probably are able to at least accept the perception better. So long-winded way of answering your question, whether there's a kind of, I mean, look, we all want to think consciousness is non-local, and you know, we are excited about quantum theories of that. If that's true, then of course, and there's some link between the brain and it, then yeah, I mean, then of course, there's all sorts of knowledge to be gained there, and that is extratemporal and so on. But you know, I'm not a physicist. I am a consciousness researcher in a very different sense. I wrote a book about it, but I wrote a kind of philosophical book that an anthropologist would write with very different kinds of data than scientific data. But I think I'm very interested in that. And I think there's a lot to it.
I'm not going to improve on that. I'm going to let that stand.
It's fascinating. Yeah. You wonder if we've been born into the wrong culture in a lot of ways. It's not.
I will.
Yeah.
Sorry, I will say this. John gave a lot of thought to this. Obviously, that's passport to the cosmos. Is that, you know, he's got an unfinished book when worldviews collide. That is very much about this. It's like, how does the worldview, you know, inherently, you know, set up the circumstances for the being? It's the last 5 minutes of what you were just talking about there. So I think you're right in the bullseye. I really just want to let that. I can't improve on it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
All right, sorry to be long-winded, folks. It's just my nature.
Okay, it was fascinating. Fascinating stuff. Okay, well, I guess we'll go to the next question now. This is for Peter from Experiencers, and the person asking it is Mantis Awakening. Question for Peter. What are your thoughts on the apparent correlations between NHI contact experiences and what people report when taking I don't know how to say that. Oh my God. Entheogenics. Is that how you say it? Entheogenics.
I'll try finally to answer a question rapidly. I am comparing those things right now in my research. And I've spoken recently with a few people who have had psychedelic experiences with very strong NHI kind of alien content. And, you know, I don't know what to make of it. And it's not that I think there aren't some obvious things to make of it, but it's just, I don't have enough data myself. And I think there's you know, the assumption right now among a lot of experiencers is the two things are very much related. Karin and I have spoken about this, where we're both scratching our heads trying to figure out how a lot of the things we're familiar with from the data, how they relate to this other kind of experience, because there are some very strong differences. I mean, one of them is that, listen to what Karin just said about herself. She didn't need to go under hypnosis to remember experiences she had. She just remembered them. And I tend to, I don't talk to people that need hypnosis to refresh their memories. It's just and plenty of people here in the experiencer community are just like this. You all have experiences and you never forget them. And they often don't require what's called now plant medicine to happen. Most of the time they don't. So, the question is, why are some people having those experiences without any medicine enhancement? And then on the other hand, what are these other experiences that are, we term psychedelic in nature? And do they somehow get people to a state of perception and consciousness where they're better able to perceive what's taking place with the more UAP specific stuff? I think that's, to be honest, I'm not sure that's a question we'll ever be able to answer using the kind of research we're both advocating for right now and that we're both doing. I think that's the kind of question you can only answer through effectively doing research as what's called a psychonaut. You have to go have both kinds of experiences and compare them with both kinds of experiences that other people are having. And you really have to explore kind of directly to do that. I think that's actually a valid kind of investigation. It's not formalized, which is what's interesting. We do not have yet, I think generally, I know the Monroe Institute would be an example, but we generally don't, or an exception, but we generally don't have schools where people are taught to investigate using, so to speak, consciousness itself. I suspect that if we get anywhere with both kinds of experiences, that will become increasingly common, and the methods will get formalized more. They'll become more, not rigorous, but let's say it'll become better understood what's taking place with them, and you'll be able to rely on the methods more. There will be a lot less guesswork, a lot less charlatans, and a reduced ability for people who don't believe in those kinds of things or are skeptical about them to say there's nothing to them. Remote viewing is a good example of a method that was formalized for this. It's not scientific per se, it's an intelligence gathering technique, but you can't say that the people doing remote viewing were doing it under controlled conditions, and who are doing it today, and that they weren't concerned with rigorously verifying that what they believed to be an accurate perception on the part of a remote viewer, in fact, was accurate. So I think we need those kinds of techniques to make sense of what the formalized techniques, developed techniques to make sense of what the questioner is asking about.
I have a little link to it.
Yeah.
So a grin, head nod to everything Peter is saying. And then I would also say, and I'm kicking myself because I can't for the life of me pull the name of the study out fast enough for this conversation. But just in the past couple of weeks, we, our researchers, Elliot Hauser and Kimberly Engels, I think it started with Elliot in particular, were able to locate a parallel research study on psychedelics that was fairly thorough, and it breaks down all of the various different sightings and experiences that people had under these particular, I think it was DMT probably. And we're actually looking at the survey that they used adjacent to parts of the survey that we're using, and recognizing that there's definitely some overlap there, and there's definitely overlap in some of the beings seen in the way that people describe these encounters. Having said that, as someone who, and we're going to learn a lot more about it as we go along. So, but I do want to emphasize Peter's point that I think this is sort of unknowable right now. This is Elliot. Elliot's going to tell me right now. This is him. This is the
That's funny.
Elliot, well done, thank you. So this is Lawrence et al. 2022, the phenomenology of inhaled DMT science advances. And this is we're at the very beginning of exploring these relationships, and we'll know a lot more about it probably in a couple of years, maybe sooner if we're lucky. But the idea is that even if there's this overlap that might tell us something more about the ontology of what we're dealing with at the meta, I can, as someone who has had psychedelic experiences and who has had these physical encounters, to your point, Peter, I can say that there's significant differences, distinctions between, even though there is certainly overlaps in some ways, the two should not be conflated as the same. I mean, because there are very, very distinct, what's the word? Phenomenological characteristics about, an abduction encounter, let's say, or direct contact event, an onboard event, compared to, a psychedelic event. And that doesn't mean that's not a value judgment. Again, this is for me always about ontological implications and what are we learning here. Okay. Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Karin. Thank you, Peter. We'll go on to the next question. Next question is for Peter. It's from the experiencers group from Matty JM. Peter, if it becomes clear in the future that some NHI are humanoids, should they be included in the research of anthropology? In other words, do you foresee a revision of what is considered human and what is considered non-human in the future?
Well, let's because we've gone ahead and let ourselves really talk about the real stuff, and I haven't been self-censoring. I'll say, look, this stuff has almost no place in academia right now, zero place. Just UAP have no place in academia outside of a few emergent things going on, like the Society for UAP Studies, some of the work Sol does, the Archives of the Impossible, and the John Mack Institute, the Galileo Project. So, I mean, yes, of course, it doesn't need to be that that we discover or verify that occupants exist and are real in the way that we think things in waking reality are real. They should be part of an anthropology, and anthropologists can, in a sense, study anything they want. It's a kind of anything goes discipline, at least social and cultural anthropology. And there have been dissertations and articles written over the years by anthropologists and folklorists who kind of are offshoot of anthropology about things like humanoids, UFOs, abductions. Thomas Bullard was a folklorist who did really fantastic work, actually, on abductions. I think it's some of the best stuff that I know in terms of verifying that it's real, because he used a method used in, just to say this briefly, used by folklorists to compare urban legends and folk tales to show that abduction narratives don't obey the rules that folk tales do. As abduction narratives spread over space and time, they remained, according to him, completely homogeneous in the different elements they contained in the structure. And that's not what a folktale does or an urban legend. An urban legend, like, there were rats in my pizza box, or the hook man came and left a hook on my car when I was parked somewhere. These kinds of legends that in childhood or adolescence we believe are true tales, but aren't. Folk tales, when they spread through time and across space, they vary, they change, and they sometimes transform into new tales. What Bullard showed was that, in fact, really the abduction narratives never change. I thought I should add that because I think that's interesting, or they were not changing in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Karin may tell us how they've changed, but at that time, they were very invariant, and that's not how a myth or folktale behaves as it's passed from culture to culture or place to place. That's something we really know objectively in anthropology. So that's an example of how anthropologists can and have studied this. But you're asking, of course, a much more profound question, which is, it's two things. Should anthropology as a field of study change if there are humanoids? Well, of course it would have to. But second, will our sense of being human change if there are humanoids? I think this is a really, really, this is like the question we have to be asking ourselves, because, the whole conundrum of the humanoids, especially when scientists who are into UAP are confronted with them, is that they shouldn't be there. There shouldn't be a bunch of bipedal beings with dorsal asymmetry and faces and eyes that can breathe the air. Jacques wrote a lot about this to say it's absurd that these things could breathe our oxygen and so on. And there are a lot of arguments, including from astrobiologists, about how these things shouldn't exist. Now, of course, in the kind of pop discourse about humanoids, the comeback is, well, we're their descendants, they seeded us, they come from the future, things that we can't really prove or disprove. They're not falsifiable. But the conundrum here is that if they're real, something's amiss in our understanding of the probability of certain kinds of life. And something has to be wrong in our understanding of human evolution. Something has to be, and it could be as simple as it didn't take place without witnesses. And something has to be wrong in the argument that the conditions of life here would be so unique that it would only produce the human form here. There are just too many. There are too many humanoids in the UAP literature, and it really calls for explanation. Well, regardless of why, if they're there, we're going to understand ourselves as a species and also as social, political, technological beings very differently, because we will gain a sense that a lot of what we take to be unique to ourselves as human is not unique to us, even just complex technology. But I would say a whole bunch of other things that are traits for people like me, the human, that we're social in nature. We're social animals. We have politics, we have culture, we have myth, cosmology, narrative, that our cognition is linked to our brain in a certain way, or the format of our brain, or to put that in a clumsy way. But we really are going to we're really going to confront the fact that what we thought was unique to us, because we were only looking, we had no point of comparison, is not. And we're going to be asking all sorts of questions about our origins. But I ponder it this way. There are different possibilities here. Imagine that there was something like a presidential disclosure in 5 years. I don't know that in our lifetimes we would have answers to these questions, because it's not clear that what we might do in acknowledging the existence of UAP and so-called NHI is going to lead to some flood of information coming from outside ourselves. It may not at all. We just really don't know. Anyway, I'll stop with that. The answer. So.
Just to add on to linking to something you said earlier in it, this is precisely what our data shows right now. And again, we'll, when we have the final, statistics on it, we'll certainly share that. But, one of the driving narratives is that the narrative of abductees is, has been or was very, very consistent from person to person, no matter their socioeconomic status or their professional background or college, education level, et cetera. And to your point, again, we see this precipitous drop off after at the end of the 20th century. So I can't speak, to the kind of events that are happening now because they seem to be occurring in a different way. But our data is definitely going to show these repeated, narratives over and over again, which is profound when one thinks about this was pre-interwebs, right? And you don't think too much about it now because there's so much, opportunity for information exchange. But these are people who truly didn't have access to each other from, all over the globe who were describing the same event. So I think that's a powerful data point that we'll learn more about as we go along. So I just wanted to punctuate that.
Folks, we have just a few more minutes and we have to end this incredible session here, but I just have one final question for Karin. The question is, Karin, what are your thoughts on the connection between abduction and sleep paralysis and the impact of the research done by Rich McNally and Susan Clancy claiming to find a link between SP abduction and sexual abuse?
Well,
that's a loaded question.
As someone who participated in Rich McNally and Susan Clancy's study, I actually have a few things to say about this, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to get this on record as well. Rich McNally, started out, and by the way, Susan was his postdoc at the time, so this would have been around the year 2000. They did the study where they made an assumption that the experiencers were obviously lying, right? That this was not an actual phenomenon, and we were the controlled group, alongside a group of individuals who had suffered actual PTSD. And in the project, they set us up with a number of different sensors to various parts of our bodies, and so that they could detect heart rate, skin conductance, and muscle tension. They hooked up some things to our head as well. So I can't remember if that was an EEG or something else, but we were pretty wired in. And then they played back a read narrative of one of our most traumatic, or profound contact experiences. The resulting involuntary physiological responses that experiencers had during this study were found to be as strong or stronger than responses from veterans whose wartime experiences were known to be actually real. But then rather than taking this as evidence that experiencers had lived through real events, Rich and Susan announced that they discovered that completely unreal events like alien encounters were capable of producing the same responses as real experiences, right? And so in 2003, I'll just squeeze this in real quick. In 2003, Rich presented their findings to the Harvard Mind and Brain Behavior, Junior Symposium. This was something that John actually invited me to. So I sat in on this as Rich presented his findings to a group of undergraduates and a number of his colleagues. And after, putting his findings out there, quite a number of the peers said, Rich, you're arguing against your own findings here. You're arguing against your own results, to which he had no real counterpoint. So to just, put a finer point on it, they have released, summaries of their studies, and the conclusion that they jumped to is that it must be sleep paralysis, because when the abductee describes being awakened in sleep, so they note that there was sleep to begin with, then they notice that there was paralysis that was occurring, and then they make this, rush to judgment that, oh, this is sleep paralysis, and we don't know why these individuals are coming up with some, why they have a desire to explain away their sleep paralysis with an abduction scenario. But there you go, sort of people are weird. The reality is that they make these assumptions too, that the abductee was recovered the memories from hypnosis. And of course, especially in my case, that absolutely wasn't true. The encounter that I shared with them was the one that I had during full waking consciousness. So there's just flawed reasoning, flawed methodology, flawed conclusions. And it's really unfortunate that this study has been cited so many different times, because it's just flat wrong. So that's
great. Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that. Put that one to bed. I remember when that came out and how upset it was, and so it's kind of disingenuous. We have to wrap up now. Unfortunately, if so, Peter and Karin, if either one of you just want to give some brief final comment or talk about something that might be coming up that you want people to know about, or how people might be able to contribute to your work, or anything else along those lines, let's do that, and then we'll have to say goodnight. So, Peter, is there anything you want to talk about coming up in the future?
I have a couple of things I want to put out there. One is that Sol will make an announcement soon about a more regular online presence that we're going to have. So I'd ask that you look out for that, and we'd really like to have people involved in that. I think it's going to be something that people appreciate, because we're wanting to create a forum which kind of extends what we do in our symposium, so that people have a way to participate in a discussion like this one. It'll be a little, briefer each time we do it, that where, they can take a reflective view on their experiences, on new science, on things happening with government, on UAP. And, we just want to make available the work we're doing on a more regular basis to more people. So, ask you to look out for that and consider participating. Secondly, the work we're doing and that I'm leading on these very questions with experiencers is something that we're always seeking financial support for. And, I'm not somebody who feels real comfortable making fundraising pitches in contexts like this, but I still want to put that out there, because if there are some people in the audience who are impassioned about this and want to see the work succeed, the intention is, as I said at the outset, to really offer a very broad empirical survey of this stuff and offer a new theory of it. And so, if there's anyone who is interested in supporting it, please get in touch with us through our website. There's a email address there, gifts@thesoulfoundation.org. It's the best way to reach us about that. And I appreciate everybody listening to that kind of pitch. We are not, nobody's making much money from this. And the operational costs at Soul can be pretty high, especially for symposium. So I know there's a lot of complaints about so-called grifting. That's not what we're doing. We're nonprofit. Research is expensive. We have a lot of different research initiatives, and we have to find ways to fund them all. So, and I'm sure, Karin's going to say the same thing about the John Mack Institute, about the need for support. So, please consider support of both organizations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead, Karin.
Yeah, I'm just I'll link there. I'll start there and then go back to the Archives of the Impossible conference. So yeah, it's the same. It costs a lot of money to do this kind of research. And, I certainly, used to be shy about asking for resources in environments like this. And at a certain point, you just have to get over it. The research is incredibly important. It's going to change the cultural dialogue, and it costs money to do to manage all of the human resources and tools that we require, including AI tools, et cetera, that we're developing to help us with this work. So we have a donate button at the Archives of the Impossible webpage at Rice University. If you are compelled to help us with our work or curious to learn more about it, then don't hesitate to reach out to us. And there are a number of different email addresses there that you can respond to, and somebody will respond hopefully fairly promptly. Although please bear with us, we're in preparation mode for Archives of the Impossible 2025, and Peter knows what that's like when you're head down in the final stretch toward a conference. It's just a bit about managed chaos at that point. Just it's flooded all day long every day. But that was really my only other second thing to say, was that we do have a conference coming up, Archives of the Impossible 2025. It's Jeff is going to kill me. I forget what the title is. UAP in the Impossible, I think.
I forget too.
Yeah, I think I'm close to it. Or the UFO in the Impossible. So Peter will be there speaking, as will Carl and other Carl Nell and other Gary. And other folks that you guys would recognize as well. And we're unfortunately sold out at the moment for in-person.
but you can go online to attend remotely for $50 for over the course of 3 days. So it's a great value. We'll be streaming it live as the conference is ongoing. So that's it.
Great. That's
Thank
great.
you.
I'll be there too, and I can't wait for that. And I really enjoyed the last Soul Foundation conference, and I look forward to more of those. And I'm really glad you're doing this online project, Peter. That's going to be fantastic. So the only thing I want to plug, since you guys plugged something, is the series that I helped produce called UFOs Investigating the Unknown, which season 2, we did season 1 2 years ago. I work with a company called Breakthrough Films, an independent company who made this series for National Geographic. Season 2 just came out in January. And we were, as was mentioned, we were able to do 2 episodes out of 6 on experiencers. I'm not saying the other episodes aren't all great, but those were particularly important because we were able to integrate that material into a broader framework, which was all about science, basically. So Peter and Karin were both part of that series, as were a lot of other amazing people. So I would just want to encourage people to watch it, partly because we want to be able to do season 3. And if we can do season 3, we will be covering the work that you have heard about today, both Peter's work and Karin's work. The research that they're doing, no matter what stage it's at, we're going to be covering that in our next season 3. And so the more people that watch season 2, the more likely we will be getting the green light to do season 3. So there's my plug for that. It's streaming right now on Hulu and Disney+. That's where season 2 is, if you can watch it. And Hulu has a free 30-day trial, so you can go on and watch it for free and then disconnect. So anyway, I want to thank all the Reddit people who are backstage right now, this incredible team of volunteers who put this thing together and who do these AMAs that are just so informative. And we get to go in depth and spend a lot of time with fascinating people. They are just an amazing group of people. That's all I can say. And they all have these strange names, so I don't think I can name them in public. But anyway, thank you very much to you guys back there. And of course, Karin and Peter, it was just so enlightening to hear what you guys had to say. I really, really appreciate it. Appreciate being able to share the space with you. And
Yeah, Leslie,
thank you for being on.
thank you, Leslie, for moderating. And I think we should thank again the Anomalous Coalition and everybody involved. It's been a great event for us. And I would like, and I think Leslie and Karin would as well, to thank all the experiencers here. You know, I really meant what I said, and I think I speak on behalf of all of us, that you know, you all are the people that need to be listened to right now. So I hope you all will have the courage in whatever way you feel comfortable to be confident and bold about, you know, sharing what you've experienced, what your insights are, what you may know with other people. It's really important, and I think the time has arrived where there's going to be wider receptivity to that.
Right.
You know, it's a slow process, but I think we're kind of getting there. So
I agree. And I think the work that both of you are doing are major in getting us there. And I think you're going to provide umbrellas in which the experiencers can go under to be protected, to be safe, and to be able to contribute to something that has huge credibility and huge potential. So I can't thank you both enough for what you're doing.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Peter.
Good night, everybody. We'll see you at the next AMA. Have a wonderful evening.